black in terms of getting to things, but that central part seemed to, you know, it just moved. I mean, it's as though Detroit as a concept or as an entity moved, and a lot of people have talked about that. The auto industry basically moved out of town. Well, in that context, maybe this one is a little bit different than options in other places around the country because of how far we're down the road. And I guess the point I'm trying to make, have you done mapping in terms of economic activity? That is, the value of the properties and the value of the activity, well, you know, how many cars are produced, what that's doing in terms of the tax flow in your overall presentation, or have you, I got the impression you were focusing more on transportation and more on residential housing as contrasted to the, what it seems to me that in Michigan we're always talking about we got to get more jobs. It doesn't really matter where you live or whether you get to the job, we got to have more jobs. And then those jobs go someplace and you know, the rest, well, adapt or something like that.
Yeah, those colored maps that I was showing do actually account for the number of jobs. It's more complicated than I wanted to explain, but it incorporates both the ability to travel to a place, but also they're weighted by what's at the other end. And so one reason you see that dark blob around Troy in sort of the center of the region is because that's precisely where most of the jobs are. So these measures do incorporate that as sort of a weighting measure. Now that's for jobs. Now in terms of the other things like grocery stores and banks and things like that, those are weighted in terms of number of employees, again, to incorporate that aspect that you're talking about. Yeah, but you're absolutely right. These maps are reflecting precisely what you're describing. Things have just moved out, abandoned the central city, and so most of the jobs are now located about 15 miles away from downtown Detroit.
My question gets back to the point that Dr. Thomas was making, which is namely that, you know, we need to do something about this kind of issue, and it needs to come from the top down. We need to have the state look at it and say, okay, how are we going to do this as a collection of people? How are we going to implement things from the top, and then take to different communities and really make a difference? Let communities do their own work, but establish a framework. And I was wondering from each of you, if you know, hypothetically could sit down with the governor and say, look, my one thing that I would love you to take on is X. What would each of you say to them?
Which governor did you have?
A generic.
Wow. Any ideas?
But I mean, she's cutting education funding, and she in the legislature profoundly, and this is our seed corn that she's throwing away. And I would say we very badly need to maintain our educational systems and improve them in our cities. Many people move away because their kids need to, they'd have to send their kids, in their view, to private school, and they prefer to leave. So that's one. Another is some of this, and I recognize the political infeasibility of lots of this, but the stronger land use controls on the fringe so that we stop the widespread development of the property at the edge and preserve more natural areas and encourage reuse towards the center.
Well, I think I would go back to the land use. I really think the Leadership Council came up with some excellent suggestions, and I think we need to go back to those. The difficulty, of course, now is whoever is governor has to deal with the current economic crisis. So this is not the time to come with new programs or things that should be done. But certainly if not now, when? At some point, we have to look again. I would look at this containment issue as one of the major ones. And I would not see, I would counsel not seeing urban revitalization as a separate issue from economic development in the state of Michigan. I think they're very much tied together. That we are essentially losing dollars because we are abandoning our cities, and we are not gaining the kinds of benefits that we could gain from paying attention to our cities. So it would take probably several days of several people from several backgrounds sitting with the governor to really advise in this area, but I think there are a lot of ideas out there.
It's a great question, good idea. I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I'm going to come back to my same refrain that I think that there's something regional that we're lacking. That is, the distress that we're feeling in our central cities is largely due to our inability to cooperate across municipal boundaries. Now, this is a governor level issue because I'm seeing a warming as a result of that. I do. I mean, I'm just as an interested citizen observer watching from outside. It seems to me that a lot of the friction is starting to melt away a little bit, and now there's more productive talk about Cobo Center and other things. So I think that that's a positive outcome.
There's actually going to be a forum at Wayne State University probably in a couple of months. I think it's maybe in March, to address great myths about the city of Detroit. I don't know if you've been following Time magazine, but they've come up with some doozies. So one of the myths that they'll have 3 questions, and one of the myths they'll be addressing is it's the mayor's fault. Because I think basically it's true that whether or not you have someone who's interested in cooperation is important. I think there's been too much blame on who is in the mayor's seat. I think I love the concept of looking at regional bodies as a way of getting above this sort of blaming in terms of mayors.
Let's go to the back, and then we'll come up here, and then we'll probably have to
I just had a follow-up question to what you said about the, I guess, melting of tensions, so to speak. Do you think that has to do with anything generational? I mean, because for example, my generation, we're not from what I've seen among my friends, we're not as afraid to go to downtown Detroit as my parents, and especially my grandparents are. Do you think that has anything to do with it?
Afraid of going downtown.
I'll take a crack at that. I've heard that from a number of people, and I think it's wonderful that there is a shifting of awareness. I'll give you an example. Our attitudes towards gay persons, for example, is something that has really shifted in a short period of time, so that people of your generation are really approaching these social questions about what sorts of rights gays and lesbians can have in our society is really, really starting to shift. And so I think that there's something to do with the cultural explanation. But on the other hand, I'm a little bit worried about taking that too far, because the history of racial hostility in our region goes back 150 years with lots of very, very difficult issues that have been branded into the minds of people that I think it's going to take a long time to overcome. So I wouldn't push that argument too far, if that makes any sense.
Last question.
No question, just a statement. There's a couple movements that I know is occurring now, and one of which is initiated by Phil Powers. I think it's called Changing from Michigan.
Center for Michigan.
Center for Michigan, right. And the other one is the former Detroit Renaissance, and this is a new entity now. The point being, you kind of picked up on the young man's comment here, what we're talking about is a policy issue. How do we change policy or get policy adopted to create the kinds of change that we're talking about? And movements such as those and others, and I'm not necessarily advocating for or against, movements such as those are the kinds of ways you create change. And so that's something, and I'm not suggesting that you do that, you should do that. But I'm just saying that's something that needs to be done.
Well, that excellent
excellent comment just now is a segue